Draw near, witness to wonders, but brace yourself. Tonight's tale stretches beyond the comfortable bounds of mortal understanding. Can you feel it? The way the very air seems to thrum with power too vast for human comprehension. Tonight, I must speak with the voice of one who has glimpsed the mechanisms that hold existence itself in balance. This voice belongs to someone who has stood in sanctuaries that exist outside time's flow, who has witnessed the stirring of powers so ancient that their names were forgotten before the first mortal drew breath. I speak now as one who has seen the moment when forces that shaped reality's first foundations decided that their eternal slumber must end. When beings who measure time in aeons must act within the span of mortal days. The chronicle I share unfolds in dimensions parallel to our own, where geometric beings communicate through pure mathematics and libraries contain knowledge that spans all possible futures. 'Tis a tale of cosmic architecture under threat, of divine power forced to abandon their careful neutrality, and of the terrible moment when gods themselves must gamble with the very foundations of existence. Steel yourself for wonders that dwarf earthly magic, friend, as I tell you of the Ancient Alliance. A story of platinum dragons and maimed gods, of reality's architects awakening to crisis, and of the discovery that sometimes even the mightiest powers must trust in mortal courage to preserve what they cannot protect alone. In sanctuaries that existed outside the normal flow of time, where the sound of battle had never echoed and the concept of defeat had no meaning, powers that had slumbered for aeons began to stir as the fundamental order of existence came under assault. These were not the familiar gods that mortals worshipped in temples and shrines, but the primordial forces that had shaped reality in its earliest forms. Entities whose very names had been forgotten by all but the most ancient beings in creation. The Ancient Alliance had been forged in the earliest days of creation, when the forces of law and chaos, good and evil, had established the cosmic framework that allowed multiple forms of existence to coexist without destroying each other. The compact that bound these powers together was not a treaty in any conventional sense, but a fundamental agreement about the nature of reality itself, encoded into the very structure of existence in ways that made it impossible to violate, without risking the collapse of everything that had been built upon its foundation. Now, as that framework faced its greatest threat in a millennia, the Alliance prepared to act with all the terrible might that beings of such vast power could bring to bear. The decision to intervene directly was not made lightly, for such action carried risks that could destabilize the very foundations they sought to protect. But the alternative, allowing Tiamat's corruption to spread unchecked, posed an even greater threat to the stability of existence itself. Bahamut, the platinum dragon, manifested first in a temple of white marble that existed simultaneously in multiple planes, his form radiating divine authority that made even the holiest artifacts seem dim by comparison. His scales reflected not light, but pure concept, each one containing truths about justice and protection that mortal minds could glimpse, but never fully comprehend. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated through dimensions, reaching every corner of reality where his influence had ever been felt.
"The compact is broken,"
he declared, his words causing crystalline formations to resonate in caves deep beneath mountains, while libraries across multiple planes found new volumes appearing on their shelves, containing knowledge that had been held in reserve for exactly this moment.
"The boundaries our predecessors established to maintain cosmic stability have been breached by forces that mistake destruction for transformation. The time for restraint has ended."
Around him, other entities of comparable power began to manifest, each one representing aspects of existence that had remained in careful balance for so long that younger races had come to take their stability for granted. Their appearance was not the dramatic materialization that mortals might expect, but a gradual intensification of presence that made the space around them more real, more significant than it had been before their arrival. Mystra, the goddess of magic itself, appeared as a figure of pure arcane energy whose presence caused every spell being cast throughout the multiverse to briefly strengthen, as if the fundamental forces of magic were rallying to meet the challenge that threatened their orderly operation. Her manifestation brought clarity to magical workings that had been corrupted by Tiamat's influence, restoring proper function to enchantments that had been twisted toward malevolent purposes. Tia, the maimed god of justice, manifested with his missing hand replaced by a construct of pure law that could rewrite reality according to principles of absolute fairness. His presence brought order to regions where the planar collision had introduced chaos, his very existence serving as an anchor that prevented further deterioration of natural law and provided stability for those who fought against the forces of corruption. But perhaps the most surprising was the appearance of entities whose involvement in mortal affairs had been so rare that many scholars had come to doubt their continued existence. The primal forces that had shaped reality in its earliest forms began to stir, their attention drawn by disturbances that threatened the fundamental architecture they had labored eons to establish. The Council of Stars, beings so ancient that they remembered the first moments when matter and energy separated from undifferentiated possibility, sent representatives whose forms were geometric patterns that existed in more dimensions than mortal perception could follow. Their communication consisted of mathematical relationships that conveyed meaning through their structural properties of conceptual space, rather than through conventional language. But their message was clear enough. The stability of existence itself was at stake. The Eternal Library manifested its avatar in the form of a scholar, whose mind contained every piece of knowledge that had ever been discovered or would ever be discovered. Their presence bringing order to regions where the planar collision had introduced uncertainty about the nature of truth itself. Where they walked, facts became stable again, and cause and effect relationships resumed their normal operation despite the chaos that surrounded them. But the most significant arrival was that of entities who had never before involved themselves in conflicts that took place within the boundaries of normal space and time. The architects of reality, the powers who had originally designed the cosmic framework that allowed multiple planes of existence to coexist, sent fragments of their consciousness to assess the damage and determine what measures would be necessary to preserve their ancient work. The contamination is more extensive than our initial observations suggested, reported one of the architects, its communication taking the form of structural changes in nearby reality that conveyed information through direct modification of local natural law. The invasion is not limited to dimensional boundaries. It is beginning to affect the fundamental mathematical relationships that govern the operation of physical law itself. The assembled powers considered this information with the kind of careful deliberation that came from operating in scales where individual decisions could affect the fate of entire universes. The crisis they faced was not just a matter of defeating an enemy or preventing a catastrophe. It was a question of whether the basic framework of existence could be preserved intact or would need to be completely rebuilt from first principles. Direct intervention carries its own risks, observed Mystra, her voice carrying warnings that resonated through every magical working currently in progress throughout the multiverse. The forces necessary to counter Tiamat's influence operating at this scale could destabilize the very foundations we seek to protect. We risk creating solutions that are worse than the problems they address. But Bahamut's response carried the authority of one who had witnessed the consequences of inaction in the face of cosmic threats. The alternative is complete rewriting of reality according to the principles that leave no place for growth,
change, or the kind of divine intervention that serves to protect rather than to dominate. If we do not act now, there may be no framework left to preserve.
The decision to intervene directly required careful coordination among beings whose normal methods of operation was so different that communication between them had previously been limited to the most essential matters. The Alliance would need to act in concert, combining their various forms of power in ways that had never been attempted, while simultaneously avoiding the kind of cosmic interference that could destroy the very realms they sought to protect. The plan that emerged from their deliberations was as elegant as it was desperate. Rather than attempting to directly oppose Tiamat's influence, they would work to strengthen the fundamental structures that her presence was undermining, reinforcing the cosmic architecture from multiple directions simultaneously. Each member of the Alliance would contribute their particular strengths to a collective working that would seek to restore stability to regions where the planar collision had introduced chaos. Bahamut would focus on the psychological and spiritual aspects of the crisis, working to preserve individual consciousness and free will in areas where Tiamat's influence was converting independent minds into components of hive mind collectives. His power would manifest as protective auras that allowed people to maintain their individual identity, even while surrounded by energies that sought to strip away their capacity for independent thought. Mystra would concentrate on restoring the normal operation of magical law in regions where the planar collision had introduced chaotic elements that made spellcasting unreliable or dangerous. Her intervention would take the form of stabilizing fields that allowed magic to operate according to its intended principles, rather than being corrupted by influences from planes where different rules applied. Tia would work to restore the operation of natural law and logical causation in areas where the intersection of different planes had created conditions where effect preceded cause, or where contradictory states of affairs could exist simultaneously. His power would manifest as zones of absolute logical consistency that served as anchors for rational thought and strategic planning. The architects of reality would focus on the most fundamental level of the crisis, working to repair damage to the basic mathematical relationships that governed the operation of physical law. Their intervention would be largely invisible to mortal perception, but its effects would be felt as the gradual restoration of predictable behavior to natural phenomena had become unreliable. But perhaps most importantly, the Alliance would coordinate their efforts to create sanctuaries where mortal heroes could operate effectively, despite the cosmic chaos surrounding them. These zones of stability would serve as staging areas for resistance efforts, providing reliable bases from which determined individuals could strike at the sources of corruption that were feeding the planar collision. The implementation of the Alliance's plan required them to operate on scales and timelines that challenged even their vast capabilities. Powers that normally thought in terms of geological ages were forced to act within timeframes measured in hours or days, while entities accustomed to working in isolation had to coordinate their efforts with unprecedented precision. The immediate effects of their intervention were felt throughout the regions affected by the planar collision, as zones of chaotic interference began to stabilize, and areas where normal law had broken down gradually returned to predictable operation. People who had been losing their individual identity to hive mind influences found their capacity for independent thought restored, while communities that had been fragmenting under the pressure of alien psychological influences began to re-establish social bonds based on human rather than cosmic values. But the Alliance intervention also triggered fierce resistance from Tiamat's consciousness, as the Dragon Queen recognized that her transformation of reality was being challenged by forces capable of effective opposition. The conflict that erupted was conducted on levels of existence that mortal perception could barely detect. A war fought with weapons of pure concept and shields made of absolute principle. The battle between divine forces created secondary effects that rippled through multiple planes of existence, causing phenomena that challenged the understanding of even the most learned scholars. Time began to flow backward in some locations while accelerating dramatically in others. Gravity became negotiable in regions where the conflict was most intense, responding to emotional states rather than physical mass. The very concept of individual identity became unstable in areas where the opposing powers met most directly. But despite the cosmic scope of the conflict, both sides understood that the ultimate outcome would be determined not by their own direct confrontation, but by the actions of mortal heroes who possessed the freedom to choose their own destiny. The Alliance's intervention had created opportunities for effective resistance, but taking advantage of those opportunities would require courage and wisdom from individuals who might not even understand the cosmic significance of their choices. The ancient powers had done what they could do to preserve the framework of existence. But the battle for the soul of reality would be fought by ordinary people who had found the strength to stand against impossible odds. The Alliance would continue to provide what support they could, but the ultimate decision about the nature of existence would rest with those who were most directly affected by the outcome. The mortal beings whose capacity for growth and change made them both the most vulnerable to Tiamat's influence and the most powerful force for resistance against it. And so, this tale draws to a close. Though its echoes may linger in your dreams, the fire burns lower now. But don't despair. I've countless more stories waiting to be shared with you. If this tale stirred something within you, if it reminded you why magic still matters in this mundane world, then please, light your own beacon. The glowing thumbs up tells the spirit of story that our fellowship grows stronger. Subscribe to join our circle permanently and toll the notification bell. That's where you'll know the moment I return with new chronicles. The fire burns brightest when more souls gather around it. Wouldn't you agree? Now, if that's the case, share this tale with another weary soul who needs it, reminding them adventure still exists. Tag a friend who would appreciate a good story by the fire. The more who believe, the more real these worlds become. And if you are new to our hearth, explore the playlist of chronicles that I've gathered. Tales of heroes and villains, love and loss, magic and mystery, each one carefully chosen for souls like yours. Until the fire calls us together again, may your own adventures be worthy of legend, and may you never lose the wonder that brought you here tonight. Travel or sleep well, brave soul. The long rest awaits your return.